Thanks very much for coming to the Cambridge Forum and our discussion about the app generation with Howard Gardner and Katie Davis. I'm Kara Miller, the host of Innovation Hub on WGBH. I'm going to moderate the program. So over the past decade, Katie Davis and Howard Gardner have really taken an intense look at how technology affects young people, adolescents particularly. And they've done this in a bunch of ways. One is by interviewing a lot of young people, by doing focus groups with young people, with longtime educators, even by looking at the difference between the work that was done decades ago by young people and the work that is produced now. And they look at a few main areas in which technology may be changing young people. One is identity, second is intimacy, and the third is imagination. And they use these terms app-enabled and app-dependent. So one of the questions is, what do these terms mean, and how has this generation been altered by the digital age? What are the upsides of being immersed in technology all the time? What are the downsides? So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm going to introduce both of our speakers, and we'll get right to it. Howard Gardner is the John H. and Elizabeth A. Hobbs Professor of Cognition and Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He also holds positions as Adjunct Professor of Psychology at Harvard University, and he is the Senior Director of Harvard Project Zero. He is the author of 29 books translated into 32 languages, as well as several hundred articles. He is best known for his theory of multiple intelligences, and among other numerous honors, he was awarded a MacArthur Prize Fellowship in 1981. He has honorary degrees from 29 colleges and universities, and has twice been named one of the 100 most influential public intellectuals in the world. Katie Davis is an assistant professor at the University of Washington Information School, where she studies the role of digital media technologies in adolescents' lives. She also serves as an advisory board member for MTV's digital abuse campaign, A Thin Line. Prior to joining the faculty at the University of Washington, Katie worked as project manager at Harvard Project Zero, where she was a member of the Good Play Project and Developing Minds and Digital Media Project, which conducted the research described in the book, The App Generation. So let's hear from both of them first, and then we'll go to questions, and most importantly, your questions.
Thanks, Kara, and good evening, everybody. I thought we'd begin by both Katie and myself describing how we got interested in the project that led to the book. I've always had a peripheral interest in new technology and new media. I'm not an early adopter, but I at least look at it as an educator and as a psychologist. And when I heard that a foundation was asking the question, how are young people being affected by the new digital media, I asked the question, well, what about the ethics of the digital media? What about things like privacy and intellectual property? And we began a project called the Good Play Project, which Katie and I were involved in for several years. Shortly after undertaking the Good Play Project, a curious friend of ours with some means said to me, but Howard, how are kids' brains affected by the new technology? And I said, well, we have to open up the skull to take a look at the brains. I don't know if we can answer that question, but I think maybe we can answer the question about how are their minds affected. And there's, of course, a lot of speculation about that. There are books coming out all the time, but as Kara said in introduction, we actually approach this in an empirical way. Katie, why don't you say a bit about how you got involved and about how we approach things?
Sure. So, as Howard mentioned, we've been working together for several years, looking at the role of digital media technologies in young people's lives. And I joined Howard and Harvard Project Zero as a doctoral student in 2005, right when Howard was starting to ask these questions. And I had just been, for several years, an elementary school teacher and was very aware that technology was increasingly becoming central in the lives of my students. And I was still a little bit ahead of the curve than they were at that time in 2003, 2004. I knew what an iPod was and they didn't, and a variety of other things. But I was also becoming very well aware that they were just about to overtake me. And I was very interested in how these technologies were going to impact their development, both academically and just simply as human beings. So I was very fortunate when I came to Harvard to study with Howard that these were questions that he was also asking. And from there, we've spent the last 7 years studying in this area, and the fruits of our labor are the book. Did you want to say something?
No, just Katie. So what are the big ideas in the book?
So the big idea, I would say, is the title, the app generation. And we held that title under lock and key for many months, hoping, praying that no one would scoop us. And I might just start by just saying a word about why we coined the term the app generation. And it might help to start by considering what exactly an app is. So as we've come to know apps, basically they're those little icons on our phone or our tablets, and they let us perform discrete tasks, whether it's finding the nearest coffee shop or checking the Patriots score, which I'm sure some of you are doing right now, or looking up the name of that actor in the movie that you're watching. Apps let us do all these things very quickly and on demand. And you might think of them as shortcuts of sorts. So they take you straight to what you want to do. No need for messy web search or anything like that. Apps are also very plentiful. So in the Apple Store alone, there are about 1 million different apps in all sorts of categories spanning productivity, music, art, lifestyle, games, anything you can think of pretty much. They're plentiful, but it's important to note that they're not infinite. And importantly, each app lets you do very particular tasks and won't let you go much beyond the range of activities that the app developer has programmed into that particular app. That's going to become important in just a moment. And finally, the last feature that I wanted to bring your attention to is the visual representation of an app. So if you consider the apps that you have on your phone, the Facebook F or the Twitter Bird or the Amazon shopping cart, these are very evocative, these logos, and they really underscore the fact that apps are very much wrapped up in their external representation. So that again is another idea that is important to us in this book and one that we explore. So it's our argument in the book that young people today are not just immersed in apps. They have come to see their world as a collection of apps, and in fact their lives as a string of ordered apps. And so we explore in the book what we're calling an app mentality. This idea that any questions that young people have or desires, they look immediately to the appropriate app to satisfy their desire or to answer their question. And if the appropriate app isn't available, well, then they expect one to be devised immediately. And if one can't be devised, well, then perhaps that original desire or that original question doesn't or shouldn't matter. So the question is this app mentality good or is it bad? And in many ways, a life infused with apps can be terrific. I know I depend on my apps to take care of the mundane tasks like showing me where the nearest gas station is or helping me do my banking. And when you use apps in this way to take care of those mundane daily tasks, they can free you up to explore new paths and to form deeper relationships and ponder the great mysteries of life. When apps are used in that way, we call it app enabling. However, there's a less optimistic view of apps. And there's a danger, we feel, and in our research suggests, that when we become overly dependent on apps for answers, for social connection, or for our sense of ourselves, when we look to apps first before looking inside of ourselves, that's when we become dependent on apps, and we call that app dependence. And it's really when we start to see more of our apps than ourselves in our daily actions and our self-expressions, and we call that app dependence. And so we've been exploring for the last several years this tension between app enabling and app dependence, and generally this app mentality in three spheres of life experience that Kara mentioned that are particularly salient for young people, and that's identity, intimacy, and imagination. And so before exploring how each of those three I's manifests in the app mentality, I'm going to pass it over to Howard to give us some background, intellectual, and historical foundation of the three I's.
Thanks, Katie. Actually, the book begins with a conversation between myself, who is on any definition a digital immigrant, Katie's sister Molly, who was at the time 16, who on any definition is a digital native. She cannot think about life before the internet, the web, and social media, and Katie's kind of liminal. She is very skilled and conversant with the apps, but she remembers life before apps, and I certainly do. I was in England a month or so ago talking about the book, and I actually asked the audience there whether they were aware of the two intellectual figures who lie behind the book, in my view, and I was kind of disappointed that they hadn't heard of either of them. But I thought that here in Cambridge, where they lived, I would mention their name and hope a few people would at least nod their heads. One of them was David Reisman, who wrote a book called The Lonely Crowd, and this is my copy from the 50s. You can see, sorry for the radio people, it's quite shop-worn, held together by Scotch tape and rubber bands and so on. And David Reisman was one of my teachers. He was a sociologist, and this is actually my copy from 1162, so it's over 50 years ago, of Erik Erikson's book Childhood and Society. And Erikson was actually my tutor when I was a student at Harvard 50 years ago. So why are these people the godfathers of the book? Reisman was probably the most famous public intellectual in the world in the 1950s and 60s. He was a sociologist, and in The Lonely Crowd, he made a very interesting argument. He said in the 18th century, Americans were tradition-directed. That means they did what their forefathers, usually in Europe, had done. They looked to the past, to religion, and so on. In the 19th century, Reisman argued, Americans were inner-directed. They went to the frontier, they developed their own goals, they had a kind of a gyroscope in them which told them what to do, and they kind of rejected the past. In the 20th century, and this is why the book got so much attention 60, 70 years ago, Americans were other-directed. They were always looking to see what the Joneses were doing. This was the area of the mass media, it was the area of suburbia, and people didn't pay that much attention to the past, they didn't follow their own inner conscience, they wanted to keep up with everybody else. So when we were thinking about the era that we're looking at, we coined the phrase app-directed, because rather than looking at the past, inside what other people are doing, kids are spending their time looking at their devices, and that's guiding what they do. So that's app-directedness. Erikson is probably better known to people, was a psychoanalyst who developed a very well-known theory of human development as a series of life crises that one had to confront. And there were actually 8 life crises, the first one being the crisis of trust, which you face as an infant. The crises we were interested in were the ones which are faced by young people as they're coming into their majority. The crisis of adolescence, Erikson called the identity crisis. Who are you? How do you develop your own sense rather than simply taking what was done before? And your own sense of who you are has to make some sense to the wider community. It can't just be solipsistic. When you've dealt with the identity crisis, Erikson argued, you then have the crisis of early adulthood, of intimacy versus isolation. Are you able to form deep ties with others, particularly with significant others, or do you live in your own world, isolated, or as Sherry Turkle, who was in an earlier one of these programs, said, are you alone together with other people? That's the intimacy and isolation challenge. And then, as you begin to carry out work and have a family, there's the crisis of, do you create something new? The crisis of generativity, both in terms of having offspring, but also in terms of ideas that are productive, or do you stagnate? Are you kind of stuck in the mud? So as an organizational principle for our study, we looked at how young people confront issues of identity, how they decide who they are, how they are able or not able to form relationships with other people, and then when they carry on their own work, do they do it in an imaginative, creative way, or are they just spinning wheels? So Katie, tell us in a bit more detail than Kara did exactly what the methods were that we used, to remind me, I do remember, and what we found.
Sure. So, and I should say that we definitely had Reisman and Erickson in our mind, but we didn't necessarily have these three I's in mind when we first started this research. Those kind of came halfway through as we did a first round of interviews with 40 veteran educators who had been teaching young people for at least 20 years. And we basically talked to them for 2 or 3 hours at a time individually and asked them simply, how have kids changed since you've started as a teacher? And we didn't say anything about technology, but invariably it came up sometimes and often in the first sentence. And in culling through those interview transcripts, we identified those three I's of identity, intimacy, and imagination as salient themes and ones that seem to be particularly tied to the digital media. And then in our second stage of research, we conducted a series of focus groups with professionals who had worked with young people in a variety of different capacities. So we interviewed camp directors, and Howard held a focus group with psychoanalysts, I think.
16 psychoanalysts.
Psychoanalysts. I wasn't there, unfortunately. We talked to religious leaders, after-school directors, arts teachers, music teachers, so a variety of different professionals, and again, we asked them, how have kids changed? In all, it was about over 100 adults that we talked to. Then we also interviewed and surveyed over 2,000 young people, because of course it's important to talk to the young people and just to get a good sense, and this is really what my research really focuses on at the University of Washington, is how do young people experience technologies and what role does it play in every aspect of their lives. And then, as Kara also referred to, the third strand of our research involved actually looking at young people's artistic productions. So we did an in-depth analysis of about 500 creative writing and visual art productions that young people had produced over the last 20 years, and we looked at changes in various dimensions, both thematic and structural. So what I'd like to do now that we have that foundation of where the three I's came from, I think what I'll do is just take each I in turn and highlight some of the salient themes that emerge and that we discuss in the book, and discuss how the app mentality manifests in each of these three domains. So we start with identity, with the self, and then we kind of go out to relationships and one's relationship with creative expression. And so with identity, we find that the identities of young peoples today are increasingly externally oriented. And they spend a tremendous amount of time crafting and putting forth a certain desirable image of themselves that is geared towards particular audiences, both real and imagined. And we as adults may not think they are desirable images, but that's because they're not always geared towards us, of course. And these very packaged, externally oriented identities are not unlike the branded icon of an app. And more generally, apps and also the social media sites that they provide access to seem to encourage this emphasis on personal branding and packaging. And, if you think of the emergence in recent years of status updates and selfies and profile likes, all of these are symptoms of this emerging trend. And one effect of this packaging, of this external orientation, of course, is a diminishment of the internal life. And that includes reflection on one's personal values and one's goals and desires in life. Another potential effect of the app identity is the giving up a certain degree of human agency in the way we express ourselves. Now, of course, in the book we acknowledge that the internet and social media have opened up a variety of new avenues for self-expression, and many of the young people who we spoke with certainly take advantage of these new avenues, and they express themselves in quite creative and new ways on sites like Tumblr and Twitter and Instagram and DeviantArt. But at the same time, it's important to note something I mentioned earlier. One of the key features of an app is that, and technology in general, is that our self-expressions are constrained in a way by the decisions that the app developer or the social media site designer has built into that particular app or site. It's also constrained in important ways by the social norms that are emergent on any particular social media site. So we believe that though young people may feel that their identities are highly unique and highly individualized, they're not completely. They are constrained and in some ways predetermined by the decisions of that particular developer of that particular site. And I actually wanted to just read a quote from a review of the book that was recently published in Forbes by Jordan Shapiro, who I think represents this idea very well. And he says, in other words, we ought to remember that our social media personality brands are not necessarily autonomous self-expressions. They can also fortify a particular app's perspective. Like cattle branding, the logos, agendas, and priorities of our corporate ranchers are indelibly burned into the hides of our public identities. Very, I think, well put. And
you can see how you may feel inadequate if you can't create a sterling brand for yourself, because there's a lot of social pressure from the maybe more perfect than they really should be identities that others create in the social media.
Mm-hmm. So our second I is intimacy, and we found, and this is no surprise I'm sure to you, that youth are always connected, but they're not necessarily always connecting deeply with one another. And of course it's hard to connect deeply when you're managing hundreds of different friends across a variety of different social media sites, communicating with them in less than 140 characters, while doing 10 other different things. And we find in our conversations with young people that there's a certain reluctance to experience vulnerability in relationships. And of course, vulnerability is key to establishing intimacy with someone. They find that it's easier to communicate their personal feelings often through a screen rather than by confronting someone face to face, because you don't have to look at someone's immediate response. And if you consider the connection to apps, as I noted earlier, apps are shortcuts. And so when it comes to personal relationships, such shortcuts can make interacting with others much quicker and easier and also less risky, because you can simply just close out the app whenever you want to, whenever you feel that you're getting a little too vulnerable. Now, when these shortcuts are used in moderation to augment rather than replace face-to-face relationships, then they can really support and nurture meaningful relationships. But the danger is when they move to replacing rather than augmenting relationships. That's when there's a danger of developing impoverished relationships, ones that are more transactional rather than transformational. Did you want to add anything to intimacy?
Yeah, well, one of the striking statistics we ran into was that some years ago, a national survey asked people, how many individuals do you actually trust if you have something personal and private to discuss with them? And the mean answer in the United States was 3, which is not a lot. And then more recently, the same question was posed, and the mean is now 2. So it's been reduced by 1/3. Now, in no way can we say this is a result of the digital media, but it's a paradox that people have hundreds of friends, so-called, like, dislike, and so on, but yet there are very, very few people that they feel they can really trust. And I think that's worrisome, though, again, it certainly isn't simply a product of the digital media.
Yeah, and one other just anecdote that we mentioned in the book is, so we have a through line throughout the book of a conversation among Howard, myself, and my sister Molly. I would like to say I'm only 5 years older than her, but they're 17 years apart. So, but she told us how sometimes when she's on Facebook, she actually feels kind of lonely and a little bit left out because everyone on Facebook seems to be having so much more fun, and they seem to be, very glamorous in their pictures and all of this sort of thing. And right after she said that to us, we started hearing that in conversations with other young people, and also we found research supporting this. And I think there's a study out of Michigan that showed in a 2-week span, participants in their study, those who spent more time on Facebook tended to have a lower affect and were in a worse mood, versus those who had spent more time interacting with people offline actually felt better about themselves. So that sort of supported and reinforced what we were hearing from Molly. So I'm going to move now on to imagination, which is our third eye. Actually, so there are over 1 million apps just in the Apple Store alone, and a sizable portion of those apps are dedicated to artistic expression. So and I'm sure you're familiar with this, there are apps for drawing and painting, for music composition and mixing and filmmaking. Pretty much any sort of artistic endeavor that you can think of, you can get an app for that. And more generally, digital media have opened up exciting new opportunities for young people to explore and express themselves creatively. Yet, just as I noted with identity, the range of artistic expression that you can do with any given app is constrained by the programming decisions of that app developer. So if you are working with a drawing app, for instance, your color palette is going to be limited to the range of hues that app developer has put into that app. And the same thing goes if you're working with a music composition app. Your tonal range is going to be similarly limited. Now, of course, there are going to be enterprising, sophisticated young people who have excellent technical skills. A lot of them are at the University of Washington Information School where I teach, and they're developing their own apps, and they can develop their own workarounds and break free from the constraints of apps. But by and large, most people are going to stick within the parameters of any given app. And that raises really important questions about how such boundaries affect the creative process. When you create with an app, are you going to really be able to produce a groundbreaking work of art? And in our analyses of 20 years' worth of young people's artistic products, we found two divergent patterns. So in the visual domain, we found evidence that young people's visual art productions are becoming more complex and more sophisticated, and really pushing the boundaries in interesting ways. But in contrast, we found the complete opposite trend when we looked at young people's creative writing. There we found that there was much less playing with different genres, and the themes that they grappled with in more recent stories tended to stick close to home and really were more mundane, everyday type stories with characters that tended to be high school students rather than anyone else. And so they really stuck to home. So it raises a question of maybe life in a digital media world may be affecting different domains of creativity in different ways. Howard, did you want to add to the imagination?
Only I wonder whether nowadays we talk about big C creativity, Picasso, Einstein, or little c creativity, which is most of us, and we may in the digital world have more middle C creativity, namely people working together and doing stuff which is more interesting than any of us can do alone, but less of the isolated genius who comes up with something totally new. I'd like to think about Steve Jobs in this context because he had more to do with the invention of apps probably than anybody else, and yet it's quite clear he wasn't going to let anybody else apps tell him what to do. He was his completely his own man. Do you want to add anything, or should I wrap it up?
No, I think that...
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to try to wrap it up because I know Kara has questions and probably the audience as well. There's one other term in the book. We talked about the generation as being app-directed. That's our twist on Reisman. And we talked about the positive sides of being app-enabled as well as the less positive side of becoming dependent on apps. But we also have created the term called super app. And this is something that many parents and teachers will recognize. And that is the notion that first you have to go to the right school, and then you have to go to the right college, and then you have to have the right major, and then you have to have the right internship, and then you have to go and work in Silicon Valley or in Wall Street, but it's okay to take off 2 years at Teach for America because that will add to your luster of your resume. And one of the things that we've observed, and many other people as well, I mean, David Brooks being a well-known example, is that there's a tendency now to think of life as being one ordered step after another, kind of from cradle to crematorium, if you will. And again, it would be wrong to pin this on the digital media. It's probably due to many different factors, and it certainly isn't unique to our time. But we think, if you think of your daily life as being a series of apps and as always being in the world of apps, it's more difficult to think of the life decisions that you make as being of a very different kind of flavor. So that's the super app. It's playing at your neighborhood theater. And I wanted to close with a couple of points from the conclusion of the book. The book tries to steer an even course between utopias, namely that apps are going to save the world, and dystopias, namely that they're going to be destructive. So one thing is we take a quotation from a great scholar, Alfred North Whitehead. Whitehead said, "Civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking about them." And at first blush, this sounds perfect. And when Katie was talking earlier about how many things she does with apps, I don't do as many, but I do some, it's really wonderful to think about things that you had to worry about, like, will I be able to get to this party on time? You've got a GPS which just tells you what to do. But we began to think about this. We said, but who decides what the important operations are? And can we really let somebody else decide what it is that's important, or do we want to be agents of that ourselves? And kind of a shock for me as a digital immigrant was that nowadays most young people have never been lost. They've never had the experience of being lost. And we need to tell the app generation that, when you get lost, you get when you get lost, you get found again. It's not like a permanent condition. Are we having a sound problem? Well, we have to tell young people that technology doesn't always work. That's part. I'd like to close with a conversation with somebody even younger than Katie's sister Molly, and that is my grandson Oscar, who was 6 years old when we were finishing the book. And I said to him, what would happen if I took away your iPhone? And he said, I wouldn't be sad because I'd still have a computer. Well, what's it like? He said, it's bigger than my mom's, very, very edible. What do you do on it? He said, search on toys, go to .com, do some things like HeroFactory.com, little things I can write a little code into the line so I can play some sort of game. So I was a bit taken aback by this facility with digital language. So I said, do you ever Google anything, Oscar? And he said, I Google everything. Amazon, like anything I need to go to Google or write it down. And I said, you sound a bit exasperated. And he says, kind of, but I'm not sure I know what exasperated means. So the conversation goes on. I'm not going to quote it all, but I do want to quote the end of the conversation. I said to him, how do you feel when your parents say, put it away? Oscar, feel a little bit blue, a little bit blue. He says this kind of plaintively. How would you feel, I ask, if your parents took all your computers and phones away for a few weeks? Oscar, I feel a little bit blue, but I could actually have a little more freedom. Play with my toys, play with Aggie, his sister, go to places with Mom and Dad. Howard, what do you mean by freedom? Oscar says, mostly people have technology. That's his word. It's not a word I give him. Most people have technology. They're watching every game and doing it all day and don't do anything else but just watch TV. So, without devices, you can play with toys and things like that. And it actually made me feel that there's hope that Oscar may not be completely app-dependent. He realizes that there are things outside of apps that were not dreamt of in his philosophy. So I think with that, I will turn it over to Kara, who may have some questions to raise.
So let me just say first, you're listening to the Cambridge Forum as we continue our discussion of the app generation with Howard Gardner and Katie Davis. I'm Kara Miller. So let me ask you first, Katie, you mentioned talking to a lot of people who've been teaching for a long time, right, and asking them what had changed. And Howard, you talk in the book about being at Harvard for a long time and talking about how Harvard students have changed. So give me a sense of how have 17-year-olds changed in the last 30, 40 years?
Well, let me start here because we did, as Katie said, many interviews of adults who'd worked with kids for 20 years or more. And the biggest surprise was something which I hadn't expected at all, is that one adult after another said, the kids today are risk averse. And that was something that I would never have come up with on my own. And then someone said to me the other day, they said, well, don't adults always say that about kids? I said, I grew up in the 1960s and nobody said that kids were risk averse then. But then I thought about my own students, and I've had students over the decades, and I would say the single biggest change in students, and the students continue to be quite wonderful, is their desire to know every specific about what they want. How many pages should the paper be? How many sections should there be in? What font size should be used? Do we need footnotes of what sort? And there's nothing wrong with that, but my own memory, and I hope it isn't just romantic, was when I went to school years and years ago, it was kind of fun. It was figuring out what maybe might be wanted, but also what I might want to do. And this hyper-precision, which may well be tied to the precision of devices, is something that I had watched over the years, but I'd never thought of it in terms of being risk-averse.
So to go along with that, I think maybe perhaps reinforcing that theme that we identified is the changing role of parents in young people's lives, and the emergence of the helicopter parent, I think, is what we could can all relate to. But we heard a lot of different stories from professionals in a bunch of different contexts saying that parents are increasingly very concerned about shepherding their children very safely through every stage of development and wanting to maximize their chances of getting into the best high school and then college and then career. And I think one telling anecdote that we relay in the story came from our conversation with camp directors. And, you know, in most camps, it seems, particularly in the Northeast, those were the camp directors we spoke with, these camps have a no technology policy, so when kids arrive, they have to give up their cell phones for the duration of the camp. And one camp director told us, as the others were nodding, that often parents will send their children to camp with 2 phones, one to give up and one to hide, so that they can maintain constant communication with their children. And I personally, that resonates with me, because I went to camp when I was a kid, and Molly then went to the same camp as I did 17 years later. When I went, I was gone for a month. I said goodbye to my parents, never saw them, or I really didn't write them for a month. But with Molly, all of a sudden, the camp now has a website, and they take pictures of the kids every day. So my mother, every day, was calling me when Molly was a child at camp, saying, well, Molly's in this picture. Can you look, do her clothes look clean or dirty, or does she look happy? You know, this is the same parent, but she's in a different environment now of parenting, and the technology is causing her to change her parenting style. And we certainly don't lay this all at the hands of technology. There are certainly a lot of other factors at play here, but I think that that's one very telling anecdote, and that we heard from a lot of different educators.
I think one thing we can't tie to technology, and I haven't experienced this much myself because I work with graduate students primarily, but in interviewing deans of students at various schools, is how often it is not the student who's complaining but the parents. And that wouldn't happen if the kids couldn't be in constant contact. So that's kind of, to me, very, very surprising.
Is there a separation there between, I mean, I don't know if you looked at students that were very high achieving, students that were lower achieving. For example, with the Harvard situation, it strikes me that perhaps apart from technology, it's much, much harder to get into Harvard than it once was. Like if you look at the admissions rate.
It was very hard.
It was very hard, but even harder now. And so I wonder if the kinds of people, right, who are so driven that they're able to get their kids to Harvard, it simply is just a different kind of parent, and it's not necessarily technology, but that's how hard you have to push to be, I don't know what their acceptance rate is this year, but like in the 7% or in the, you know, whatever percent gets accepted.
Yeah, I think for sure that is one, the economic exigencies of today are really behind part of this concern that parents have, because there's such competition and they want to protect their children from failure that is very real and very possible. So I think that is certainly has one aspect to do with it, but it is just, you know, the constant connection and communication with one's children. So there's a researcher at Middlebury who found that on average in a given week, college students are in contact with at least one parent over 13 times in a given week at college. You know, and college is generally a time when you separate from one's parents and you develop a sense of autonomy, at least in the Western Hemisphere. So that's very different. Again, myself and my sister were having very different experiences of college.
Another question, and then I want to open it up to some of your questions. One thing that really fascinates me is the issue of being alone and maybe being bored. You referenced Sherry Turkle from MIT, Howard, and her concept of alone together, and we've all sort of seen it where two people will be out, let's say on a date or whatever, and they're both on their cell phones, so they're kind of together, but like with other people on the date somehow, or they're walking down the street holding hands on their cell phones. So I wonder, what happens when instead of waiting for a friend to get to dinner or waiting for somebody to come off the train or whatever, and being bored for a minute and having to think thoughts, you pull something out and you think, well, this would be a good time to text somebody, or I could catch up on what's happening right in sports or on the New York Times. Not that what you're doing is a waste of time, but you're never bored ever. Does that have an effect?
Yeah, I feel very strongly about this, but I have to say that it may be a kind of romanticism on my part. Part of the app generation, the super app, is that you're always thinking about the next thing, which, as you say, Kara, can be, how do I catch up on the 999th thing that I didn't yet? But the cost of that, I won't even say boredom. It's sort of simply time to reflect. And so with some colleagues at Harvard, some years ago, we set up something called Reflecting on Your Life, which are non-credit sessions for freshmen just to get together and to think about some of the big issues which apps don't have answers to. And not only has it been very useful for the freshmen, but it's begun to percolate up to upperclassmen, and we now have a consortium of schools in the Northeast which are meeting for various kinds of reflection and time, sometimes more meditative, sometimes more journaling, where you can be alone with your thoughts in a positive way. Katie is halfway through, and I finished a book called The Circle by Dave Eggers. And that's a book which talks about a time when there's no private thought whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Everything that you think is known and monitored, and it's seen as a good thing. And when I say I may be a romantic, I don't think I could ever think that's a good thing, but it's possible that 50 years from now people will laugh at notions of reflection and boredom and so on, and they will like to be active every moment and everybody else know about it. I guess I'm just as happy I'm not going to be around, but Katie will be. So
yeah, I would just add one other point to that. So what Howard was just talking about are conscious thoughts and the importance of spending time alone to have your conscious reflective thoughts. But there's another side, and those are the unconscious thoughts. And the brain, there's research showing that the brain derives benefits from just being at rest, because actually it's not really at rest. It's forming all sorts of connections and coming up with thoughts when we don't even think we're necessarily coming up with thoughts. So it's those both, time to really consciously reflect on your own, but also time to let your brain restore itself and form its own connections.
You just actually gave me an idea for research. I don't think I'm the first, but what do we know about how dreams are changing? That would be a very, very interesting things to look at. Of course, there's huge amounts of data of dreams ever since Freud, who was Erickson's teacher.
You're listening to Howard Gardner and Katie Davis discussing their new book, The App Generation, How Today's Youth Navigate Identity, Intimacy, and Imagination in a Digital World. So we're going to take some questions from the audience. So if you have some, line up here.